Hi.
Hi, Andrea. How are you?
Hi. Good, and you? And
Good,
I put
good,
my video.
good. So, do you think we can start?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, okay. Just a second. Um,
Hey. Okay.
okay, so now I have my presentation opened. Okay, so we can broadcast. Yeah. Great. We have 5, 6, 7, 8. And this. Okay, so maybe we can start. We have 17 attendees right now, and we have our panelists. My name is Ksenia Kirichenko, and I'm from ILGA World. This webinar is for LGBTI activists and those who are interested in international human rights law when it comes to issues related to sexual orientation, gender identity, sex characteristics, and gender expression. And for our participants, you should have access to Q&A section. So maybe you can see it on your screen. So you can ask questions to panelists or us during the webinar. You should also have access to chat. So maybe someone can try to type something into chat. Hello, hi. Hi, Gunzada. I can see that someone is already here. So thank you for joining us today. And I know that there is a very difficult time for many of us, and we are all in different places. I'm particularly right here. I'm in Canada, in Montreal. I'm sure that you are from different spaces. So this webinar is based on the anonymity principle, which means that we will be recording this webinar. We are recording this webinar, but your personal data will not be recorded. And in the Q&A section, so there is a questions and answers. You can ask your questions, and if you are concerned about sensitivity of the data you include into your question, you can also pick up to ask the question anonymously. So you can ask us questions, and if you care about your security for whatever reasons, please mark that you want to ask this question anonymously, and this will guarantee that no one except for us panelists will see your name or specific information you provided here. And if you still have any other concerns when it comes to your confidentiality, you can send any questions to us via email, and this will be completely confidential, of course. So we are doing recording. This webinar will be for approximately 1.5 hours. So in my case, for example, we start at 9:30 a.m., which is time in Montreal, and we will finish at noon. And we will have several more theoretical sessions, and between them we will have 2 sessions for questions and answers. And this webinar is provided by 2 organizations, ILGA World, and I represent ILGA World, so I'm Senior Officer on Women and UN Advocacy with ILGA World. And we also have here Andrea Sepulveda, who is representing CCPR-Centre, which is also international NGO, specifically focusing on the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and Human Rights Committee, and the engagement of non-governmental organizations with the Human Rights Committee. So basically the topic we are going to discover today together. But I'm sure Andrea will be able to talk more about your work and CCPR-Centre a bit later. And as I mentioned, so this webinar is for you, for LGBTI human rights defenders or professionals in the field of international human rights law who wants to know more about LGBTI human rights. And specific topic of this webinar is follow-up recommendations by the Human Rights Committee. So we will talk about Human Rights Committee, follow-up recommendations, LGBTI human rights recommendation by the Human Rights Committee, but also this webinar could be specifically important and useful for 2 groups of countries. So one group is the countries which received already follow-up recommendations on LGBTI topics from the Human Rights Committee. And I know that at least some of you are from these countries. So for example, Lithuania or Estonia or Mongolia, but you will see the full list of these countries a bit later. So in this case, if you already have these recommendations, you can think about how you're going to work with these recommendations, how you're going to engage with your government, how you can provide shadow reports to the committee, etc., etc. And the second group of countries are countries which will be reviewed by the Human Rights Committee this year. And this means that you can advocate for LGBTI follow-up recommendations as a result of the upcoming review. And in our call for the webinar, we also included information about these countries, but we will have a separate slide information with the list of these countries, so you will see all this. We have a presentation. We have a beautiful presentation which we created with Andrea from CCPR-Centre, and I'm going to start sharing it with you now. So I hope you can see this presentation right now. Okay, so we have this presentation, and you can see that the topic of our webinar is Human Rights Committee's follow-up recommendations. And you have 2 presenters today with you. So our webinar will include, this presentation specifically will include 6 blocks, 6 small sessions. So first we will look into generally what are treaty bodies, what are these bodies, what they are doing. Then we will see what is the Human Rights Committee, one of the United Nations treaty bodies, what are its specific features. Then the third part will be about follow-up UN recommendations in general. So what are the follow-up recommendations, how they are different from any other recommendations made by the United Nations bodies. The fourth topic, the fourth block will be about follow-up recommendations specifically by the Human Rights Committee. The fifth session will be about LGBTI follow-up recommendations. And the last block will be about examples of follow-up activities specifically organized by LGBTI groups in order to work with these follow-up recommendations. So you will see some examples of projects or activities organized by other LGBTI groups, and maybe you will have also some ideas for your own advocacy. And as I mentioned, we will also have 2 Q&A sessions between these sessions. The first Q&A session will be after block 4. So after we will finish this follow-up recommendations from the Human Rights Committee block, we will have a Q&A session. So if you will have any questions, you can type them into the block of Q&A. So you can exit this and you can type your question. If you are worried about your confidentiality, please pick up to ask the question anonymously. And after the 4th block, we will look into your questions and we will answer them. And the second block, the second Q&A session will be at the end of the webinar. So if you will still have some questions, you will be able to ask them. So yeah, and actually we also have during this presentation, we will have some interactive elements. So the first thing I would like to ask you is to ask some questions. So now you should see the questions. I hope you can see them. And we have just 2 questions for you. So the first question is, have you ever worked with the United Nations Human Rights Mechanism? So please answer this question. Yes, no, or not sure. Maybe you're not sure what are the United Nations Human Rights Mechanism, which is also okay. And the second question is, if you have such experience, with what United Nations mechanisms have you worked? And you can pick up several options. So treaty bodies, special procedures, and universal periodic review, also known as UPR. So please answer these questions. Have you ever worked with the United Nations mechanisms? And if so, what were the mechanisms you've been working with? So please answer these 2 questions, and then we will see like a general picture of people presenting here today. Anyone else wants to answer? If you want to do it, please. And these questions are anonymous, so we will not see who is answering how. Okay, so I hope everyone was able to answer. And now you can see, actually, you can see the results. So most of you, 62% of participants have worked with the United Nations mechanisms for sure. 5%, which is 1 person, not sure. Maybe you will be able to learn more about United Nations mechanisms during this webinar. And 33%, which is 7 participants, have not worked with United Nations human rights mechanisms, but maybe after this webinar you will be more equipped with knowledges to do this, or maybe you just have a different area of your professional activities. And the second question, if you have such experience, so most of the participants worked with the UPR, Universal Periodic Review, which is not the topic of our webinar, but we will talk a bit about UPR also. Then the second is special procedures, 29%. Which is interesting. And then treaty bodies, 24%. So some of you already engaged with the treaty bodies, and maybe it was even the Human Rights Committee. So let's go further. And now you can see the slide with treaty bodies. So what are the treaty bodies? Let's start from this. Treaty bodies are bodies human rights bodies under the United Nations, and they are committees of independent experts monitoring 9 main human rights treaties. So there are international treaties, and when a party ratifies, a state ratifies this treaty, it means that it will be also monitored how the human rights obligations are fulfilled. It will be monitored by a treaty body, specific treaty body, and there are 9 main human rights treaties, and in accordance with these 9 main human rights treaties, there are treaty bodies or committees. So these committees, they are independent, which means that, of course, these experts representing the committees, they come from specific countries, but they do not represent these countries. So they do not, for example, if an expert is from, let's say, Mauritius, then it will, he or they or she will not represent the official position of Mauritius. And if, for example, same-sex relations are criminalized in Mauritius, it doesn't mean that this expert will also promote this position. And moreover, most likely, this expert will support decriminalization of same-sex relations, of course, because this is about human rights. So treaty bodies, they use in their work, they use 3 main working methods, which are country periodic reviews, individual communications, and general comments. So individual communications is, let's say, something which is similar to court system. And for those of you who are from Europe or Latin America or from African countries, it's similar to regional courts, such as, for example, the European Court of Human Rights or Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So it means that after you exhaust all the domestic remedies, after you went through all the courts on the national level, if you did not get positive results, you can still bring your case further to the United Nations treaty bodies. So these are individual communications, which are decisions on individual cases against specific countries. Then there are general comments, which are authoritative explanation of articles or specific rights or methods of work enshrined in the conventions. So some conventions, they were adopted 50, 60 years ago, and of course, social relations, science, whatever else developed through this for 40 or 50 years. And in order to keep the nature of the convention living, treaty bodies, committees, they could develop explanations of specific articles or rights from the conventions. And then there are also country periodic reviews. So maybe it's the most important thing for local activists, for human rights defenders. And so country periodic reviews, it's a periodic system of reports by states. So after a state ratifies specific convention, it has to provide periodic reports about implementation of these conventions. And first time it's initial report. And after that, each 4, 5, 6 years, depending on the committee, each state has to submit new periodic reports about implementation of specific conventions. And also NGOs can participate in this process because they can inform the committee about information which is missed or misinterpreted in state reports. So you can also submit shadow reports under these country periodic reviews. And at some points, you can also come to Geneva to participate in sessions directly, to engage with treaty bodies experts, to tell them about specific situations with human rights of LGBTI people in your countries, and through this to receive good recommendations from the committee. So here you can see a scheme of treaty bodies. So I mentioned that there are treaty bodies, committees of independent experts monitoring 9 main human rights treaties. So these 9 treaty bodies and these 9 human rights treaties, you can see them on this scheme. So there are general treaty bodies, which are covering a broad range of topics. So there is, for example, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and there is a Human Rights Committee which monitors the implementation of this covenant. And there is also a CESCR committee, which is about economic, social, and cultural rights, and there is also Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Then there are also three committees which are based on issues, conventions, and also committees: the Committee Against Torture, the Committee on Enforced Disappearances, the Committee on Racial Discrimination, and last but not least, there are 4 committees based on specific populations, such as women. Maybe some of you know about CEDAW, which is the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. There is also a committee on the rights of the child, migrant workers, and persons with disabilities. So this is like general information about what are treaty bodies, what they are doing, and one of the treaty bodies is Human Rights Committee. And now I also want to tell you about specifically the process of country periodic reviews and 2 models which could be implemented by committees. So one thing is standard reporting procedure. So you can see the scheme of standard reporting procedure here. So when a state ratifies convention or covenant, it has to provide initial state report to tell the committee, to write to the committee about how it implemented specific rights and obligations enshrined in this covenant or convention. Then after that, after the state submits its state report, the committee can hold so-called pre-session. So the committee could prepare for the follow review, and as a result of this pre-session and as a result of reviewing the state report, but also shadow reports from NGOs, the committee develops so-called list of issues. So basically it's a list of issues and questions about any topics covered by state report or shadow reports. And in this list of issues, the committee could ask for additional information, statistics, cases, activities, trainings related to specific problems in the field of human rights. Then after this, there is a main session in Geneva. So the state sent official delegation to Geneva. NGOs can also participate in this session, and they can also come to Geneva and participate in NGO briefings with the committee. And there is also so-called interactive dialogue in Geneva, which is usually 1 day of a dialogue between committee members and the state delegation. So the committee members, they can ask different questions related to the covenant or convention, and then the state has to provide answers. As a result of all these stages, the committee adopts so-called concluding observations, which is a document where the committee says what are the positive aspects in relation to human rights. For example, the state adopted comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation and included sexual orientation and gender identity explicitly as protected grounds in this legislation. So this would be a positive aspects in concluding observations. There are also points of concerns. For example, the committee can say that we are concerned about the number of cases of hate crimes against LGBTI people and the lack of effective response from law enforcement bodies, for instance. It will be concerns. And then there are also recommendations related to these concerns. So the committee can say that they are concerned about the number of hate crimes against LGBTI people, and therefore they recommend the state party to organize, for instance, trainings for state officials about investigation and generally dealing with LGBTI hate crimes. Or they can say that we recommend the state party to include sexual orientation, gender identity, and maybe other also characteristics into the language of criminal code, and to recognize hatred based on SOGIESC as an aggravating circumstance. And then also in the concluding observations, there is a part related to follow-up. So at the end of every concluding observations, you can find a part related to follow-up recommendations. And further, later we will talk about what are follow-up recommendations. So, and then after the adoption of these concluding observations, during the next 4 or 5 years, the state has to implement these recommendations, and there is a follow-up stage, which means that state can follow up, the committee can follow up, and also NGOs can follow up and see what has been done in order to implement these recommendations. So this is regular reporting procedure: state report, then list of issues, then main session with the dialogue, then concluding observations, and then follow up. Now you can see that there is also, can you see this? I think there are some, I cannot see the text here. Can you see the text on the scheme? Can you please type if you can see? There is no text. So there is a text, but I'm afraid it's maybe in white. Okay, well, but the text is very similar to the left part, and also we will send this presentation to you later, so you will see the text. I'm sorry for this technical issue, but so the text is very similar. So most of the stages under the simplified reporting procedure are the same. The only changes is these 3 stages: state report, pre-session, and list of issues. So in the case of simplified reporting procedure, the first stage is list of issues prior to reporting and pre-session. So in the normal procedure, regular procedure, there is first stage is state report. State provides a report, and then based on this report, the committee develops a list of issues. When it's a simplified reporting procedure, then first stage is pre-session and list of issues, and then the report is based on this list of issues. So the report is not about all the aspects of the convention, but this report is written only based on this list of questions asked by the committee. And therefore, in the simplified reporting procedure, it's very important for NGOs to participate in the pre-session in this stage, because otherwise, all the other stages, interactive dialogue and concluding observations, they will not be able to cover all the issues. So in the general reporting procedure, regular reporting procedure, the scope of the review is kind of the whole convention. In simplified reporting procedure, it's basically list of issues is the framework. List of issues prior to reporting is a framework for the whole review, and therefore, if questions on LGBTI were not asked in the list of issues, most likely they will not be included into the concluding observations. Again, I'm sorry for this technical issue, and the presentation, you will get your presentation later. And we have here also some questions for you. Before we come. So, I hope you can see the question from the poll. What are United Nations treaty bodies? And there are 3 options. They are working groups of experts developing the content of new international treaties, or they are committees of independent experts monitoring main human rights treaties, or they are groups of states within the Human Rights Council monitoring human rights records of other states. So let's see how clear was information provided during the first part of the webinar. So please answer this poll. What are United Nations treaty bodies? Working group of experts developing new international treaties, or committees of independent experts monitoring main existing human rights treaties, or groups of states within the Human Rights Council monitoring human rights records of other states? Okay, let's see. So most of you actually picked up the right answer. they are committees of independent experts monitoring main human rights treaties. Some people said that they are groups of states within the Human Rights Council monitoring human rights records of other states, which is similar to UPR, Universal Periodic Review, but we'll see what is the difference between treaty bodies and Human Rights Committee and UPR a bit later. And we have also another poll for you. Let's see. So there is another question for you, maybe more complicated. What is the main difference between the regular and simplified reporting procedure? So the aspect we were covering right now. What is the difference between the regular reporting procedure and simplified reporting procedure? And the first option is that regular reporting procedure, it's every 4 or 5 years, and simplified, it's every 10 years. The second option is simplified reporting procedure is when treaty bodies and experts, they come to countries under review, and the regular reporting procedure is when a state sends a delegation to Geneva. And the third option is simplified reporting procedure is when a state report is based on the list of issues. And the regular reporting procedure is when list of issues is adopted after the state report. So please answer this poll also if you want. Okay, and now let's see what is the answer. So again, most of you picked up the right answer. Simplified reporting procedure is based on the list of issues, and the regular reporting procedure is the procedure where a list of issues is adopted after the state submits its report. So this is the main difference between simplified reporting procedure and regular. Two other options are, of course, not correct. The Human Rights Committee specifically is trying to use the simplified procedure more and more right now. And you can also ask us or to check the Human Rights Committee website to see what simplified reporting procedure or regular reporting procedure is working for your country specifically. So let's go further. So now we can see treaty bodies and UPR. So I know that some people, some activists, and it's completely normal, of course, because there are so many details within this system. So some people, they mix treaty bodies and specifically Human Rights Committee and UPR. And now, just to make sure that we are all on the same page, I want to explain to you the difference between UPR and treaty bodies. So there are a number of aspects using which we can compare treaty bodies with UPR. And both UPR and treaty bodies, they are kind of human rights review processes, and they are designed for countries. So under UPR and treaty bodies, these are countries who are reviewed, whose human rights records are reviewed. But then who makes the recommendations? Treaty bodies, the recommendations are made by the committees, by the independent experts, and they do not represent any states. So they should be independent, and they should not represent any specific political position or any specific position from the state. And in contrast, UPR, it's a peer-to-peer reviews by states, of the states by other states. So states, they review each other's. And it means that, for example, if the state has legislation criminalizing same-sex relations, it means that probably the state will not make recommendations to decriminalize homosexuality to other countries. So which human rights are covered? For UPR, it's all the broad range of human rights. You can include any issue into UPR for your country. For treaty bodies, it depends on the convention. So the convention under which the treaty body is created is the framework of their work. For example, if you work with CEDAW, which is the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, you can only talk about women's rights or LGBTI women's or persons' rights. And then the next aspect is how frequent is the review. For UPR is very strict, and it's every 4 years. And you can also in advance, you can know when will be deadline for your shadow submissions, when will be your session, etc., etc. For treaty bodies, it's a bit more tricky. So it depends on treaty body. First of all, what is the reporting period? Sometimes it's 4 years, sometimes it's 6 years, and also you cannot actually know well in advance, like 3 years before the review, when exactly will be your session, when exactly will be your deadline, and therefore maybe you can use specifically tables of information about deadlines published by ILGA. Or you can also, of course, check the information on the committee's websites. So what countries are covered? UPR covers all the countries. Basically all the countries. There is no need to ratify any specific instrument. For treaty bodies can review only countries which ratified specific conventions. And for example, let's say CEDAW, which is the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, has not been ratified by Iran and the United States, and therefore these two countries cannot go to CEDAW. So there are also information about ratification of different conventions available at the UN website, or you can also write to us and to ask if your country ratified a specific treaty, or you can ask us to which treaty bodies you can submit shadow reports. And then the last thing is how authoritative are the recommendations. It's also a difference between UPR and treaty bodies. So for UPR, because UPR recommendations are made by states, specific states to other states, these recommendations, they are more political, and the state under review can basically either accept or so-called noted or reject basically these recommendations. So it is the state who decides if it wants to implement specific recommendations. For treaty bodies, they are more authoritative, so they are not like hard law, of course. So it's not something which is 100% obligatory for states, but still the recommendations of treaty bodies they have more legal nature, and the state under review does not have this freedom to either accept or reject recommendations. So treaty bodies' recommendations, they cannot be rejected, at least by definition, in theory. So what else do we have here? And let's talk about the Human Rights Committee specifically. So the Human Rights Committee, so we have a question. What do you mean by authoritative recommendations? Does that come with political consequences? Embargo, extreme example. When we are talking about recommendations by United Nations human rights bodies, specifically recommendations under UPR and recommendations by treaty bodies, there could not be specific measures such as embargo or sanctions or something else. So it's not a part of this system, but still there are some mechanisms how to ensure implementation of recommendations by states. And actually the follow-up mechanism, the follow-up recommendations, their aim is specifically to create some system to monitor and to make the countries implement these recommendations. So the process of follow-up, and Andrea will tell you more soon about it, specifically aimed at implementation of these recommendations. The Human Rights Committee. What is the Human Rights Committee? The Human Rights Committee is one of the treaty bodies, and it monitors the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the international treaty which was adopted in 1966. And in this covenant you can find different rights such as freedom from torture, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of and rights to privacy, to home, to family life, provisions about equality and non-discrimination. So basically, when it comes to LGBTI rights specifically, there is a broad range of questions or issues which could be covered by the Human Rights Committee. It can be about criminalization of same-sex relations. It can be about, for example, legal gender recognition for trans people. It can be about intersex genital mutilation, etc., etc. So a broad range of different questions. Currently there are 173 states which ratified this convention, and the Human Rights Committee consists of 18 experts from different regions, from different countries who work with this Human Rights Committee. And we also have another poll here for you. About Human Rights Committee. So Human Rights Committee makes recommendations, different human rights recommendations by states. And every year the Human Rights Committee can review, let's say, 20 or so different countries. And what do you think, what is the percentage of country reviews with LGBTI recommendations by the Human Rights Committee in 2017-2018? So what percentage of countries reviewed by the Human Rights Committee during 2017-2018 received any recommendations on LGBTI populations? 100% or 90% or 20%? So please answer if you haven't done this yet. What is the percentage of country reviews with LGBTI recommendations by Human Rights Committee in 2017-2018? 100%, 80, 90%, or 20? Okay, let's see the results. Oh, most of you think that they were only 20%. Then the second 29% of our participants think that they were 90%, and only 4 people think that it's 100%. Maybe they read our reports actually, because let's see, you can see this, 100% countries with LGBTI recommendations were in 2017 and 2018. So these slides, these are just some figures about LGBTI work by Human Rights Committee to show you how open and how friendly this committee is for LGBTI activists and LGBTI issues. So in 2017 and 2018, 100% of countries reviewed by Human Rights Committee received any different recommendations on LGBTI issues, all the countries. And this is, of course, unprecedented number, because no other treaty bodies, no other committees achieved such a result. Then there are also 98 and 161. It's the number of SOGIESC or LGBTI inclusive concluding observations or references in 2014, 2019. And there are also another number, 20 cases. So 20 individual cases were reviewed by Human Rights Committee in relation to LGBTI rights. And the first case was, maybe you heard about it, the first case was Tunin versus Australia. It was a groundbreaking case about criminalization of same-sex sexual relations in Australia. And it was the first case when treaty bodies recognized the violation of LGBTI human rights by states. So it was a very important case, and it was adopted by, the decision was adopted by the Human Rights Committee, and since then, also the Human Rights Committee adopted other decisions on legal gender recognition, same-sex families, freedom of assembly, and many other cases, so you can learn more about it. Specifically, through our publication about strategic litigation before treaty bodies. So yeah, this is the end of my first part. And now I'm happy to give the floor to Andrea.
Hi, you hear me? Yes. Hello, thank you, Ksenia, and thanks everybody for participating. So as Ksenia explained before a little bit, my name is Andrea. I work for the Center for Civil and Political Rights, which is an organization based in Geneva, and we support the NGOs to participate in the Human Rights Committee. So if your country is up for review, or if your country has been reviewed in the recent past years, we can work with you to follow up, or we can work with you to prepare the reports, or to prepare to participate in the session. Usually for the LGBTI issues, we work together with ILGA. So if you contact either Ksenia or me or both of us, we're happy to provide support. In this webinar, I will focus on the follow-up recommendations. So as Ksenia explained, the Human Rights Committee, once it reviews the states, and once there is the main session here in Geneva, where there is the dialogue between the state delegation and the Human Rights Committee members, the committee will adopt a series of recommendations. Usually it's around 25 to 30 recommendations per country, focusing on the very different issues from the ICCPR, from the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And as Ksenia showed already, there is usually at least one recommendation regarding LGBTI or SOGI issues. So of all of those 25 to 30 recommendations, the Human Rights Committee will select some recommendations that are the so-called follow-up recommendations. So as in this slide, we see several UN mechanisms issue recommendations to the countries, as you know, the treaty bodies that we have been talking about, also special procedures when they visit the countries, also the universal periodic review when there's the state is reviewed by the other states. So all these issue the recommendations. Ksenia, I think I need your help to pass the slides. And if you want to allow my videos of people just don't look at the screen, as you wish. Otherwise, it's okay, no worries.
Yeah, Andrea, do you need the next slide?
No, this is okay. No, I was saying because I don't know if people want to see the person that is talking, so, and I cannot put my video, so
you cannot put your
my video. Just to people put a face in the voice.
I don't know how to do it.
Okay, no worries. I mean, you can imagine me. So if you can go back one slide. Yeah, let's continue like this. So where to find all these recommendations? There is the Universal Index of Human Rights. There is the address, and Ksenia will share the slide, the PowerPoint presentation with you. In this index, you can search the recommendations by country, by team, by mechanism, by date. So if you want, for example, to see all the recommendations issued to your country on LGBTI issues in the last 3 years, you can look like that. I have been told that sometimes it's not that easy to use that index, or that the index is not up to date. So you can also look in the webpage of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. You can also look by country, or you can look by mechanism. But this index is like a compilation of all of them, so it might be easier.
Andrea, sorry, I think you can turn on the video now.
Let me see. Yes, hi everybody. Thank you. I'm working from home, so welcome to my home. So the next slide, please. Thank you. So yeah, as I was saying, we will focus now on this webinar on the follow-up recommendations of the Human Rights Committee. So the Human Rights Committee will select 2 to 4 recommendations out of the 25 to 30 recommendations. 2 to 4 will be the so-called follow-up recommendations. The civil society organizations can suggest which issues will be selected for the follow-up. So it will be the committee that will decide which are the issues that will be selected for the follow-up, but the civil society organizations can suggest the issues that they think should be selected for the follow-up. And this can be done here in the session if you can participate in Geneva, or this can be done through your reports, or the different ways of engaging with the Human Rights Committee. This doesn't mean that the other recommendations that are not selected for the follow-up are not to be implemented. The state is supposed and requested to implement all the recommendations. It's just that there is a particular procedure for the one selected for follow-up. So the next slide, please. Thank you. So the criteria to select the follow-up recommendations by the Human Rights Committee is first the temporary possibility. So the state should be able to implement the selected recommendation within 1 or 2 years from the adoption of the recommendation. And the need of immediacy, so the severity of the situation and the emergency. So the Human Rights Committee will choose the most pressing issues for follow-up and issues that can be implemented in, let's say, 2 years. Next slide. So the deadline for the state to submit the follow-up report is 2 years since the adoption of the recommendation. So when the committee adopts the concluding observations with the list of recommendations, at the end, in the last, one before last paragraph, the committee will say, okay, the state has to submit the follow-up report on this and this and this and these recommendations by this date. So the date is very clear now on when the state has to submit the recommendations, and it's 2 years after the adoption of the recommendation. So if you want to know the exact deadline and on which issues, you have to go to the concluding observations and to check in the paragraph before the last to find this information. And the state is requested to submit this report on the measures that it has taken to implement the follow-up recommendations. So let's say that the committee adopts now, let's say in March 2020, a recommendation to decriminalize LGBTI issues in, I don't know, Cameroon. I'm just saying, like, this is not true, it's just a hypothetical example. So this means that Cameroon has from now till March of 2022 to decriminalize same-sex relations. And then in March 2022, Cameroon has to submit a report to the Human Rights Committee saying what are the measures that have done, if the legislation has been changed, if there is an initiative that is in discussion, if there was, I don't know, whatever measures they have taken, they have to submit a state report. This state report has to be concise, no more than 3,500 words for all the 3, 2, or 4 recommendations selected for the follow-up procedure. So next slide, please. So the NGOs and the Ombudspersons, the National Human Rights Institution, can also submit information to the committee after 2 years on the implementation of these recommendations by the state. So the NGOs do not have to put in the report what are the actions that they have been doing as NGOs, but they have to inform what are the actions that the state has been doing to implement those recommendations. So for example, if we go back to the decriminalization of same-sex relations in Cameroon, the NGOs, I mean, they can't say, but the committee will not consider if the NGOs have been doing campaigns or I don't know, yeah, like dissemination or awareness raising or whatever actions they have been doing, but they will consider what the state has been doing. However, the information of the NGOs is extremely important for this follow-up stage, because the Human Rights Committee will evaluate on the basis of the reports that they receive. This means that if the state is the only one submitting information, the state can say, oh yeah, I have taken many measures to implement this recommendation, I have done this, I have done that, I have done that. So it's the NGOs that can say what is the point of view of civil society regarding the actions taken by the state to implement those recommendations. So if the state is saying, yeah, I put in place an awareness raising campaign, then the NGOs can comment, yes, but the awareness raising campaign was not broad enough, or didn't include participation of civil society when developing the campaign, or you can do the comments, or you can say that the state hasn't implemented the recommendations, or you can also recognize the measures that the state has taken to implement the recommendations. So you have two options of when to submit this information. One option is irrespective of the date of the presentation of the state report, 2 years from the adoption of the concluding observations. So as I was saying, if the concluding observations have been adopted in March 2020, you can submit your information in March 2022. This is option one. Option two is that you wait for the state report, and then once the state has submitted this report and it has been published in the website of the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, you submit your own report commenting on the state report. This is a bit tricky because we are not checking all the time. I mean, I guess you are not checking all the time the page of the Human Rights Committee to see if the state has submitted or not the report. So for this, and to put like a deadline, a fixed deadline, the Human Rights Committee, since this year, they have started to fix the deadlines for submission. So now we can know in advance which are the states that are going to be reviewed, and there is a deadline for NGO submission. So for now, for this year, we have a deadline of 27th of April to submit the reports, the follow-up reports on Italy, Bosnia, Mongolia, and Thailand. And the 10th of August is for Serbia, Eswatini, Madagascar, and Honduras. So these are the ultimate deadlines. This doesn't mean that if your state, or if you want to submit a report before the deadline, you cannot do it. You can of course do it. As I was saying, either 2 years from the adoption of the concluding observations, or if you know that that your state has already submitted its follow-up report, you can submit it already now, or you can wait until the Human Rights Committee publishes the fixed deadline. So all these deadlines will be considered in a separate slide in written, the deadlines that I was talking about. So next slide, please. Yeah, so for the how to submit the follow-up report, it's the same rule as the state. It shouldn't be more than 3,500 words, and should only refer to the recommendations selected by the Human Rights Committee for the follow-up procedure. So if you see that there was a recommendation on LGBTI issues, but it has not been selected for the follow-up procedure, you have to wait until the next review, because you cannot send information on the implementation of that recommendation after 2 years if it's not part of the follow-up recommendations. So yeah, I think there will be some slides also to see which are the countries where the committee has selected the LGBTI issues for follow-up. So you will have this precise information shortly. Then the committee, what does the committee do with this information? Either like with both the reports sent by the state and the reports sent by the civil society, They evaluate depending on the degree of cooperation by the state party and depending on the nature and the impact of the measures taken to implement the selected recommendations. So the committee will evaluate. There will not be a dialogue anymore, but the committee will evaluate and will put grade A, B, C, D, or E, like in school. A, if the state implemented the recommendation fully. B, if it was partially implemented. C, if the state didn't take any action or didn't respond. No, sorry. D, if the state responded, but it didn't take any action to implement the recommendations. D, if the state does not cooperate, meaning does not send any information, does not send its follow-up report. And E, when the state party has taken measures that are contrary to or result in contrary to the committee's recommendations. So sometimes the state take measures that are against the recommendations. So in these cases, the committee can put grade E, that is the worst. It's important that the NGOs are aware of this evaluation and which are the grades that your state is getting, because it's up to the NGOs to disseminate this information through the media or like social media or to the media in your countries, like make noise around it. We will also see later what actions can be done for follow-up of the recommendations, including reaching to the media. But for me, it's very important that the NGOs have a very important role in disseminating the information. Otherwise, this will happen here in Geneva. Your state can be very good at implementing a recommendation or very, very bad at implementing a recommendation, and nobody will know. If the NGOs do not tweet about this, put Facebook, and maybe write a press article, inform the recommendations, like nobody will know. So all the efforts put into either participating in Geneva, sending your reports and everything will be like nobody will know about this. So it's important that NGOs here play a very important role in disseminating the information. So not only sending the information to the committee, but also checking which are the grades of yours or that your state got by the Human Rights Committee. So next, yeah. So this is a template of our report. We at the Center for Civil and Political Rights, we can provide you with a template like this. So this is an example of a follow-up report by Honduras. So there is a very short introduction. So here you can see in the explanation that, for example, the recommendations selected for Honduras are in paragraphs 17, voluntary termination of pregnancy, 21, right to life, 41, freedom of expression and human rights defenders, and 47, rights of minorities and indigenous peoples. It's always good that you read the recommendations, because I think in this case of Honduras, in the part of the human rights defenders, there is something specific about LGBTI human rights defenders. So sometimes you can see, oh, like these LGBTI issues were not selected for the follow-up procedure, but then if you see the text of the recommendations, you can find something. For example, sometimes the recommendation selected for the follow-up procedure is about non-discrimination, and almost for sure there will be an issue of LGBTI there. Human rights defender is another one that sometimes contains this, I don't know, hate crimes or other recommendations. Maybe sometimes right life if there have been killings of LGBTI people. So this is the introduction, and then the next part is a very simple table that we suggest that the NGOs use. So is the paragraph 17. So the first column is the recommendation of the Human Rights Committee. So the Human Rights Committee has recommended the state party to take matter of urgency, blah, blah, blah. We divided the paragraph 17. So sometimes we say we say that there are 25 to 30 recommendations, but if you analyze the document, is much more, because some recommendations you can divide it in different recommendations, like sub-recommendations of the same topic. So we suggest that the NGOs complete one column, so the column on the measures taken by the state to implement the committee's recommendations. So this is very simple template and very simple way to present the recommendations on what are the measures taken by the state since the adoption of the recommendation. So don't go before the recommendation. So what the committee wants to know is what has the state done to implement the recommendations since the adoption of the recommendations. So I think this is all my part.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Andrea. Okay, thank you once again, Andrea. And we have also a couple of questions to see how the information was received by participants. So, dear participants, please check your computers or phones. So the question is, what are the Human Rights Committee's follow-up recommendations? Option 1, a few recommendations selected by the committee in the concluding observations to be implemented by the state in the upcoming 2 years. Second option, recommendations made by the Human Rights Committee in decisions on individual cases regarding any changes of the situation in general. So recommendations in individual cases, or it's recommendations on which civil society provide information during next review cycle. What are the Human Rights Committee's follow-up recommendations? Please provide your answer. Anyone else wants to participate in the poll? It's anonymous. We will not see who provided what answers. Okay, let's see the results. So most of you actually selected the right, correct answer, which is a few recommendations selected by the committee in the concluding observations for the next 2 years. Recommendations in individual cases, decisions on individual cases are not follow-up recommendations in this sense. And also recommendations on which civil society provide information during next review cycle, it's general recommendations by the Human Rights Committee, so it's not necessarily follow-up recommendations. And we have another, also another question for you, but it's for the future slide. What do you think, which treaty body or committee made the highest number of follow-up LGBTI recommendations? What was the committee which made the highest number of follow-up recommendations on LGBTI? CEDAW, on Women Human Rights Committee, Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or maybe Universal Periodic Review, UPR. What do you think? Who made the highest number of, from treaty bodies, who made the highest number of LGBTI follow-up recommendations? Please pick up one answer and then we'll see. Okay, let's see. So most of you decided that it's Human Rights Committee, which is the true. We will see next slide. CEDAW made some follow-up recommendations on LGBTI, but not the highest number. CRPD also made some recommendations, but not the highest number. And UPR is actually not a treaty body, so it was not the option here. So let's see. This next slide, you can see that different treaty bodies, including CEDAW and the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and also, of course, Human Rights Committee, made follow-up recommendations, so kind of urgent recommendations on LGBTI issues during the period from 2014 till 2019. And you can also see that in the last 2 years, the number of follow-up recommendations on LGBTI rights even became higher. So it's a good trend for our communities. And then you can also see that in the number, like among the treaty bodies which made LGBTI follow-up recommendations, the Human Rights Committee made almost half of them, 16. And that was actually the reason why we decided to make a specific focus on the Human Rights Committee and its follow-up recommendations, because the Human Rights Committee generally is very open to consider LGBTI issues and LGBTI human rights. And also the Human Rights Committee made the highest number of follow-up recommendations on LGBTI rights. And last but not least, also the Human Rights Committee has quite a strong mechanism for follow-up recommendations. So we can actually clearly see how NGOs can participate. There is also a CCPR-Centre who provides their support for NGOs, human rights defenders who wants to participate in these processes. And therefore, this process is maybe more accessible than follow-up process within other treaty bodies. And then also I want to show you actually what were the recommendations, the follow-up recommendations picked up by the Human Rights Committee for follow-up review. So there will be several slides with specific countries, and I would also ask you to pay attention, if this is your country, to pay attention to deadlines or timelines. So in the right upper corner, you can see the deadline for state report, the deadline for NGO reports, and also time for sessions when actually the follow-up report will be reviewed. So we have Belize. The first country is Belize, with recommendations on decriminalization, on building trust between state authorities and LGBTI people, and also recommendations on investigation, prosecution, and punishment for violence based on sexual orientation and gender identity. That was Belize. Then also Bulgaria received follow-up recommendations on LGBTI, and these recommendations were on hate speech, hate crimes, and on the language of legislation, because the committee asked Bulgaria to specifically include sexual orientation and gender identity in legislation as hate motives and grounds of discrimination. So again, if we have anyone from Bulgaria, please look into these deadlines. Next country is Czechia, Czech Republic. The recommendations were about racial discrimination, hate speech, and hate crimes. And specifically, this example is interesting because probably you remember that concluding observations, they include concerns, so paragraphs with concerns when the committee says what is exactly problematic in the country, and then paragraphs with recommendations. So follow-up are only recommendations paragraphs. In this case, it's prevent and condemn hate speech, etc. But the concern itself, the concern paragraph is not to follow up, but in this case, you can see that recommendations themselves, they do not mention LGBTI explicitly, but the concern paragraph refer to LGBTI persons, which means that even though there are no specific references to LGBTI, you can still provide information, collect information, and provide information related to these recommendations in general, but specifically to LGBTI persons, and you can still submit your shadow report. So this is Czech Republic. Next country is Estonia, and Estonia received also recommendations on hate speech and hate crimes, and also recommendations to change the language of legislation to explicitly include sexual orientation and gender identity there. If you are from Estonia, please pay attention to the timelines. Honduras, the recommendations mentioned by Andrea, it was a general recommendation about human rights defenders, freedom of expression, freedom of association, etc. But in these recommendations, LGBTI persons were mentioned twice. First, when the committee asked the state to protect LGBTI persons from violence and intimidation, and second, when the committee asked to collect data about this problem. We also have Lithuania here. And Lithuania received very good recommendations for follow-up process on discrimination based on SOGI. And these recommendations included legislation, so all the issues related to legislation to ensure that the current legislation is not interpreted in a discriminatory way, to refrain from adopting any new discriminatory legislation. There was also a recommendation on same-sex couples, which is very interesting and not that usual even for the Human Rights Committee still. And there was also a recommendation on legal gender recognition. So if you have information about these three things, problems, issues, you can also submit your shadow report on this. Mongolia also received specific follow-up recommendations on sexual orientation and gender identity. And among recommendations, there were recommendations to investigate, prosecute, and punish violence and discrimination against LGBTI persons. There was a recommendation related to public LGBTI activism. And there was also a recommendation on same-sex couples. If we have anyone from Mongolia, please pay attention to these timelines. And last but not least, there was also Sudan with recommendations generally about death penalty and specifically on death penalty for so-called sodomy. So this is the examples of recommendations which were received by different countries from the Human Rights Committee. So these countries, they still have open deadlines for either both NGO information and state information, or only for state information. So for example, we can see that Mongolia, let's say, state report has been submitted already, and you can submit your report by 27th of April this year. And because you already have your state report, you can also check what information the state included into their formal report, and also provide your comments on this. Let's say Sudan, state report is still to be submitted by 2nd of November, and therefore you don't have yet this information, but still you can provide and collect your own information, and notwithstanding of what will be included into the state report, you can also submit your shadow information to the committee. It will be also very important. I actually forgot about our Q&A session, so we will come back to this right now. And so maybe Andrea, you can also help me with some questions. So I can start with some questions. So Q&A session, your questions, we will look into your questions. Someone asked about what about after going to the European Court of Justice, or in parallel to. So European Court of Justice, it's an international court, and for treaty bodies, individual cases, you have to choose. You have to choose either you are going to European Court of Justice or Inter-American Court of Human Rights, or you are going to treaty bodies, but it does not cover special procedures. So you can go to, for example, European Court plus also special procedures, or CEDAW plus also special procedures, because special procedures, they are kind of not courts, not jurisprudence procedures. Then what else?
Sorry, there is there is a slight detail with this question of going to the European Court of Justice, because the Human Rights Committee has a very particular thing that says that they cannot review a complaint that is being reviewed by other international institution, like jurisdictional institution, I think so. You cannot, as you were very right saying, you cannot present a complaint to the Human Rights Committee if the complaint is being reviewed by the European Court of Justice. However, in theory, if the complaint has been reviewed by the European Court of Justice and it's done in the European Court of Justice, you can present it to the Human Rights Committee. But the Human Rights Committee has now developed a jurisprudence that if it has been reviewed on the merits, it is not going to be accepted in the Human Rights Committee. But if it hasn't been reviewed in the merits, you can send it to the Human Rights Committee. So if you have submitted a case to the European Court of Justice, but it was dismissed for admissibility reasons, you can still send it to the Human Rights Committee. However, not at the same time. If you haven't received any reply, so if your complaint is pending at the European Court of Justice, you cannot submit it to the Human Rights Committee. But if it has been finished in the European Court of Justice, you can submit it to the Human Rights Committee, which is not the same for other treaty bodies like the Committee Against Torture, for example. Once you submit it to the European Court of Justice, you cannot submit it to the Committee Against Torture.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Andrea. Yeah,
So,
but it's exactly about merits versus admissibility. So in other words, it's if the European Court of Justice dismissed your application for formal reasons because of the procedure, not because like of the nature of the violation.
yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Andrea, do you want to answer the second question? Can you see it?
Yeah, if the state doesn't follow up, what does the international legislation say? Well, this is the question of all the international mechanisms of human rights. That as Ksenia was saying, there are no specific sanctions. If the state does not implement the recommendation, the committee cannot say a specific sanction like an embargo or economic sanctions or anything. However, in the international sphere, is very important, and most of the states do care about their, let's say, their image internationally. So this is why I was saying that it's very important that the NGOs make noise about this and put pressure on the state. So use the evaluation of the follow-up procedure of the Human Rights Committee. For example, you can use it in the UPR. Let's say that your state got a very bad grade in the Human Rights Committee, and then your state is going to be reviewed by the UPR or by another treaty body like CEDAW or the Committee Against Torture. You can bring this information to the attention of the UPR, saying my state did not comply with the recommendations of the Human Rights Committee. And then you can add pressure like international advocacy to make the state comply. Some of the states do not care at all, but other states, and most of the states, I would say, they do care, and they don't like when they are being mentioned as a state that do not comply with their recommendations. So there will not be sanctions, but it's the international pressure that will play a role here.
Thank you. So the next question is it possible to advocate the experts, the committee members, to make recommendations to states through the treaty bodies process? So yes, of course, and this is actually why it's important for you as NGO representatives to submit your shadow reports, and also to, if possible, to come to Geneva, because through this and through like giving a human face to the problem, through providing your statistics, your data, your evidences, you can actually influence the recommendations made by the committee specifically at the end of the review. And there are a lot of opportunities, and specifically CCPR-Centre helps NGOs to participate in sessions. So there are a lot of different opportunities. So there is, for example, formal NGO briefing, when you can formally deliver a short statement about the situation of LGBTI persons in your country during the session for the committee experts. There is also a 1-hour lunch briefing, informal briefing, when there are only NGOs from your country and interested committee's experts, no other like third parties, and you can more openly talk about different issues related to human rights in your country. You can, in theory, you can even sometimes have like a short 1-minute talks with friendly committee members, like in the corridor during the session. So there are a lot of different opportunities. If you come to Geneva, you can also prepare 1-pagers with the most significant, important information, or maybe new cases. So there are a lot of different things, but maybe it's a bit specific topic. Maybe we will organize another webinar for this. So then there is a question, are some reviews going to be up to every 8 years? So maybe Andrea, you can talk a bit more about like a new predictable cycle.
Yeah, so the Human Rights Committee has adopted a predictable cycle. This means that the countries are scheduled for reviews similar to the UPR. So you can know in advance when your country is going to be reviewed. And this is independently if your state submits the report or not. This is a very big change. It's starting to being implemented, but it's not yet fully confirmed. The idea is to avoid the states that were not reporting to the Human Rights Committee. So before, if your state was not reporting to the Human Rights Committee, the Human Rights Committee will not evaluate the state. And now with this new predictable reporting or predictable review calendar, the idea is that the Human Rights Committee will evaluate all the 173 states. But this means that the committee that the states will be evaluated every 8 years. In this sense, the follow-up procedure is even more important because it will be like a midterm evaluation. So it's still, there is a calendar, and the Human Rights Committee will try to comply with the calendar. And the idea is that all the other treaty bodies will have fixed calendars and will be periodically organized amongst them. So if the Human Rights Committee will review one state this year, another treaty body will review the same state next year, and like this, we will have always reviews by the treaty bodies. But this is still it's very new, and is the things that they are discussing in the light of a review of the treaty bodies that is happening this year.
Thank you. Next question is, which countries are these which had 100% of LGBTI inclusive recommendations review? So I've sent a private message to the person who asked this question specifically, and I mentioned all the countries from a specific region. But generally, you can find information about LGBTI recommendations made in a specific year in reports prepared by ILGA. So we have ILGA World, we have annual treaty bodies reports. On our website, you can find them, and soon we will publish the report for 2019. In this report, you can find compilation, but also analysis of all LGBTI recommendations made by all treaty bodies. So if you are interested in your countries being reviewed during specific year, you can go to our website to find our reports, and also to find what has been done on your specific country. Then there is a question on evaluation of responses. Maybe Andrea, maybe you can answer this.
What happens to a state is the grading is on either of the last two. What are the procedures from the committee to such kind of state? I'm not sure if I understand the question. So if
so I think what happens to a state if the grading is on either of the last two, which means state doesn't do anything or provide no information.
Okay, in the last two, and okay, yeah, thank you. And yeah, so if the state does not cooperate, or if the state takes measures against the recommendations, it's more or less the same that I was saying. So it's mainly like international pressure or international, the state that is seen as non-compliant with the recommendations of the United Nations. So it's more like, how is the state going to look mainly at the UPR when all the other states are evaluating this state. Like when the Human Rights Committee is the authoritative body that monitors the compliance of the international civil and political rights. So there, and also one thing that we haven't said here is that the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, as well as the other treaties, are legally binding. So when a state ratifies these conventions, they are legally obliged to implement and respect this convention. So it's international law. So they are legally obliged to implement them. So when a state is not complying with the recommendations of a committee that is the authoritative body to implement these recommendations, it means that they are violating their obligations, their international obligations. So as I was saying, there will not be any particular sanction, like any specific sanction, but the state will be seen and regarded by the other states like a non-complying state. Yeah, so I think this was also the question of Yuri, more or less.
So far we don't have any new questions, and I just want to finish. I'm sorry, maybe we will be a bit late, but maybe 10 more minutes, and if you can still participate in this webinar, it would be really great. So the last part is about what exactly you can organize to follow up on your recommendations. Generally, you can organize a lot of different activities around your recommendations on LGBTI human rights, and I will give you some specific examples, but generally, for instance, you can send advocacy letters to different governmental bodies requesting information. For example, asking them what is the statistics of hate crimes, or recommending them specific actions. For example, saying that the Human Rights Committee recommended to provide trainings for law enforcement. And for instance, let's say you have already developed materials for these trainings and you would be happy to share these materials with the government. So you can also recommend to have a meeting and to organize specific trainings for law enforcement as a result. You can also organize community consultations. So you can actually bring your people to a specific place and to talk to your communities about what were the recommendations. You can discuss what your community thinks about these recommendations. Do they think that it's really important right now? Do you think it reflects the priority of the community? Maybe you can get information about any specific cases of violations related to this area of problem, etc., etc. Then you can also, of course, organize individual interviews with people to ask them about, for example, if it's LGBTI persons, you can ask them about specific cases of violations happened to them. If it's interviews with state authorities, maybe you can have access to state authorities. You can also ask them about what has been done in order to implement recommendations, etc., etc. Then, for sure, case monitoring and documentation. So you can just generally organize case monitoring for your advocacy programs, and then to use specific cases for your follow-up shadow reports to the Human Rights Committee. And also, last but not least, strategic litigation and jurisprudence research. So if you have comprehensive database of jurisprudence in your country, you can just check to type, for example, CEDAW or Human Rights Committee, and to see if the Human Rights Committee or CEDAW recommendations were actually used in jurisprudence. So you can organize some kind of jurisprudence research, or when you received specific very good recommendation for LGBTI community, and you at the same time you have legal court battles happening in your countries, in this time, you can also refer to this recommendation in your court documents. And then I just want to share with you some specific examples of activities organized as follow-up after receiving LGBTI recommendations from treaty bodies by different groups. So first example is from Russia, and in 2010, 10 years ago already, CEDAW made a recommendation, general recommendation on LGBT persons, like to end discrimination against LGBT people. And the Russian LGBT Network organization participating in the review picked up this general recommendation and decided to organize something specifically for trans people. So at that time in Russia, there was unclear procedure for legal gender recognition. And the group had information that in different regions in Russia, there are different approaches towards legal gender recognition. So for example, sometimes civil register offices required surgeries for trans people to change their documents. Sometimes it was diagnosis, etc., etc. And there was no concrete legal regulation. There was no legislation regulating the process of legal gender recognition. And at the same time, there was a general law on access to public information, according to which any person or any organization could have the ability to ask for public information from authorities. And so this group, the Russian LGBT Network, created standard requests and sent them to all the regions, to civil registry offices, and also to the Ministry of Justice, and ask them what is the procedure for change of trans persons' documents in their concrete regions. So there were more than 80 different letters to different regions, and you can see one of the examples of the answer received by the Russian LGBT Network from one of the regions. So as a result of this, the defenders were able to refer to this general recommendation from CEDAW to ask different regions about their practice of legal gender recognition, to collect information, to see that actually there is no specific process, no specific adopted procedure for legal gender recognition, and to see that there are best practice examples, there are worse practice examples in one country, and also so they systematize, analyze this information, and also submit a report about different approaches and shortcomings in legal gender recognition in Russia for the next review. So this is one example how defenders use the recommendation on LGBT through advocacy letters. Another example is also from Russia and also CEDAW, but the next review of CEDAW 5 years ago. Coming out LGBT group from St. Petersburg, Russia, participated in CEDAW review, and at that time there was a homophobic campaign against LGBT teachers. So they were homophobic, let's say, activists who collected information from social media of LGBT, specifically teachers, and then they created a dossier about these teachers and sent them to school authorities or educational authorities, asking to fire these teachers, and there were several specific cases when teachers were actually fired. And here in the picture you can see media coverage of one of these cases. So this is a lesbian teacher who was fired because information from her private social media was sent to educational authorities. So at that time, Coming Out LGBT group had this case of this teacher, and at the same time there was a review by CEDAW. So it was basically online translation almost. CEDAW committee members, they were informed about every stage of court proceeding and about any development of this specific case. And as a result, there was a recommendation to ensure that LGBTI women are not discriminated in their professional life. So CEDAW was aware about this case, they made this recommendation, and then the lawyers and attorneys who were dealing with this specific case in Russian courts, they used this recommendation by CEDAW in the court proceeding. So this is the example of how LGBTI recommendations by treaty bodies can be used in jurisprudence and strategic litigation. The third example is also from Russia, and this is about the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. 3 years ago, Transgender Legal Defense Project submitted specific trans report to CESCR. It was a standalone report on trans people and legal gender recognition. As a result, the committee made the first recommendation to Russia about legal gender recognition procedure and recommended the Russian Federation to put in place a quick, transparent, and accessible procedure. Then, a few months after that, actually, the Ministry of Health, the Russian Ministry of Health, published the draft regulation on legal gender recognition for public discussion, and then Transgender Legal Defense Project participated in this public discussion and also sent an advocacy letter with their recommendations and references to CESCR to the Russian Ministry of Health. And as a result of all the sections, and according to activists, also as a result of the specific trans advocacy organized within CESCR procedures, the Russian Ministry of Health finally adopted the regulation of legal gender recognition without any, like clearly abusive requirements. For example, there is no requirement for surgery or no even a requirement for hormonal therapy. And this procedure could be seen, especially for countries such as Russia, as more or less progressive. And after this happened, the defenders also organized consultations for the community to tell them about the process of advocacy within CCPR, about recommendations by CCPR, about a new protocol for legal gender recognition, and also consultations were organized for health professionals. And last example is from the Republic of Korea. So in 2015, 5 years ago, the Human Rights Committee picked up LGBTI recommendations specifically for follow-up procedure, and then Rainbow Action Against Sexual Minority Discrimination in coalition of 84 different civil society organizations, not only LGBTI. They crafted, drafted, and submitted follow-up report to the committee. You can see that they basically used the template developed by the CCPR-Centre, but also they included information about specific cases here. They included some recommendations yeah, so this is an example of how actually you can use a follow-up procedure and how you can submit shadow reports. There was a question in chat about whether you will have access to the recording. Yes, you will have it. So you will have access to the presentation, to the recording. We can also share with you some other materials. So there will be no problem. And the last slide, and the last slide is about next steps. So I told you in the beginning that there are two groups of countries for whom these follow-up human rights committees mechanisms could be specifically important. On the left part of the slide, you can see countries which already can submit their follow-up report on LGBTI recommendations. So countries and deadlines for shadow follow-up reports: Belize, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Estonia, Honduras, Lithuania, Mongolia, and Sudan. If you are from countries on the right part of the slide, then you can think about participating in new sessions of the Human Rights Committee, and also about trying to advocate for LGBTI urgent follow-up recommendations as a result of these upcoming reviews by the Human Rights Committee. And for this, it's also important to form coalitions. So if you can find any friends in the civil society movement, any organizations, maybe women's rights organizations, maybe general mainstream human rights organizations who can support you and with whom you can ask the Human Rights Committee together as a coalition to include LGBTI issues into the follow-up recommendations, to pick up LGBTI recommendations for this urgent procedure. If you will do it in a coalition, of course, you will get more chances of actually having these recommendations as follow-up. So this is I think this is it. Yeah, thank you so much for your attention, and thank you for being here for a longer time. If you have any other questions, I would kindly ask you to also type your questions into the Q&A part of your panel. If you have any questions, please let us know, maybe in the chat. Okay, thank you. So next steps, when you will leave this webinar, you will get a feedback form. It will maybe take you 4 or 5 minutes more to fill in this form, but I would really ask you to fill in this form. It's really important for us to have your feedback. And also we have questions about topics for new webinars, so please do it. As I mentioned, we are recording this webinar, so we will be able to share a link with you. Of course, all your confidentiality will be kept, and if you have any concerns, there is no problem. If you have any questions, please let us know. Please contact ILGA World, me, or contact CCPR-Centre, Andrea. And yeah, again, we will be happy to share with you all the materials and to answer any of your questions. So I cannot see any questions from any of you, but if you will have any questions, please feel free to contact. Thank you so much. Wash your hands, keep safe, and maybe see you soon. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.